The war was over, but Japan still felt like a battlefield. Smoke had barely cleared from the cities when a single man stepped off a transport plane in Tokyo. No cheering crowd, no royal escort, no government waiting to receive him. Just silence, and the weight of a defeated empire staring back through broken streets. He wasn't a king. He wasn't an emperor. Yet within days, every order that shaped Japan's future would pass through his hands. Soldiers obeyed him. Officials feared him. Even the emperor himself would be forced into a room with him face to face with the fate of a nation hanging in the air. His name was Douglas MacArthur. And in a country of millions, one question began to spread like a whisper through the ruins. Who was really in control of Japan? Japan in 1945 was not a nation anymore in the way it once understood itself. It was exhaustion carved into streets, ash where cities used to breathe, and silence where entire armies once marched. Factories were gone. Ports were shattered. Millions were displaced, hungry, and uncertain whether the next sunrise meant survival or collapse. Into this emptiness came the occupation forces, and at their center stood one man. General Douglas MacArthur had not come to negotiate. He had not come to share authority. He had come as supreme commander of Allied forces, carrying orders that placed him above every Japanese institution still standing. At first, Japan did not understand what that meant. The emperor still existed. Hirohito remained a symbolic figure inside the palace walls. Ministers still wore suits. Officials still tried to function as if the old system had not completely collapsed. But behind every decision, every approval, every direction for survival, there was now an invisible hand guiding everything. MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo became the true center of power. Inside those walls, entire policies were drafted that would reshape Japan from the ground up. Land reforms, military dissolution, political restructuring, press freedom, education reform. Nothing moved without passing through his command. And the most shocking part? He didn't just occupy Japan militarily, he began rebuilding it politically, socially, even culturally. In the streets, people whispered about him like a myth. Some feared he would erase Japan entirely. Others believed he might be the only reason it would survive at all. But what no one yet understood was how absolute his control would become. Because this wasn't just occupation. It was the beginning of a silent empire, one ruled not by a crown, but by a general. The first true shock came when Japan's most sacred figure was told to do something no one had ever imagined possible. Inside the imperial palace, silence was heavy. The air itself felt like history holding its breath. Generations of tradition, divinity, and absolute reverence had always surrounded the throne of Hirohito. But now, that tradition was no longer untouchable. Across the city, in a heavily guarded Allied headquarters, General Douglas MacArthur was preparing something that would define the entire occupation. He demanded a meeting. Not through diplomats. Not through intermediaries. Directly, when the emperor finally agreed, it wasn't presented as a request. It was an instruction delivered with quiet finality, the kind that leaves no room for refusal. And so, Japan's divine ruler stepped out of isolation, and into a world where his authority no longer meant what it once did. On September 27, 1945, Hirohito arrived at MacArthur's headquarters. The contrast was almost unreal. One man represented centuries of imperial tradition. The other represented a modern military machine that had just ended the most destructive war in history. No cameras were allowed inside the room. But what happened in those minutes would become legend. MacArthur stood tall, unflinching, in his uniform. Hirohito, formal and restrained, faced him without the aura of divinity that once defined him outside those walls. This was not a meeting of equals, but it was also not humiliation in the way many expected. Instead, something colder, more strategic unfolded. MacArthur understood something others didn't. Breaking Japan completely would create chaos. But reshaping it could create stability. And in that single encounter, a silent agreement began to form, not spoken in grand declarations, but in controlled gestures, measured words, and the unspoken reality that Japan's future would now be redesigned under Allied authority. When the emperor left the building, nothing visible had changed. But everything had. Because from that moment forward, the fate of an entire nation no longer rested inside the palace walls. It rested in the decisions of one American general. Chapter 3 begins not with a battle, but with a dismantling. Not of cities, not of armies, but of an entire system that had shaped Japan for generations. From his headquarters in Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur began issuing orders that reached into every layer of Japanese life. And unlike wartime commands, these weren't temporary measures. They were permanent rewrites of a nation's identity. The first shock came with the military itself. Japan's armed forces once feared across the Pacific were dissolved. Soldiers were sent home. Weapons were confiscated. Entire command structures vanished almost overnight. A nation that had lived by the sword was suddenly forbidden to hold one. Then came politics. Old power structures were broken apart. Land was redistributed. Political prisoners were released. A new constitution was drafted under Allied supervision that limited imperial power and reshaped governance into something unrecognizable from wartime Japan. Every change carried the same invisible signature, MacArthur's approval. Inside Japan, reactions fractured. Some saw him as the architect of survival without him. They believed chaos or revenge would have consumed the country. Others saw something far more unsettling, a foreign commander holding absolute influence over a sovereign nation's rebirth. Even Emperor Hirohito now existed in a radically different role, no longer divine ruler, but symbolic figure within a rebuilt system designed under occupation authority. And yet, MacArthur's control wasn't enforced through fear alone. It was precision. He understood optics. He understood psychology. He knew when to appear distant and when to appear merciful. Photographs of him in Tokyo began circulating globally, tall, composed, almost presidential in presence. To many Americans, he wasn't just an occupier. He was a rebuilder of nations. But beneath that image, tension was rising. Not everyone in Washington agreed with the scale of his authority. And as the world shifted toward a new conflict in Korea, MacArthur's power, once absolute in Japan, would soon be tested from above. Because even uncrowned emperors still answer to someone. The turning point didn't come in Japan. It came from a war that began far beyond it. By the early 1950s, the world had changed again. The Cold War was tightening its grip, and Asia became its most dangerous front line. When North Korean forces surged across the border in 1950, the United States suddenly found itself in a new kind of conflict, fast, brutal, and unpredictable. And at the center of it once again stood General Douglas MacArthur. From Tokyo, he coordinated the response like a commander still ruling an empire rather than occupying a post-war nation. Troop movements, supply lines, counter-offensives, everything flowed through his command structure. Japan, rebuilt and stabilized under his earlier occupation, now became the logistical backbone of a new war. But the higher he rose in influence, the more friction began to build. Washington wanted control. MacArthur wanted freedom of command. And in Korea, that tension turned dangerous. His bold decisions, especially the push toward the Yalu River, brought him into direct conflict with political leadership back home. What he saw as decisive victory strategy, others saw as escalation that risked drawing a larger war. For the first time, the man once described as an uncrowned emperor was no longer untouchable. Messages from Washington grew sharper. Boundaries were drawn. Orders began to limit what he could do. But MacArthur did not see himself as a man to be contained. He had rebuilt Japan from ashes. He had reshaped a defeated nation. He had stood before emperors and dictated the terms of peace. Now, he was being told to step back. The breaking point came when his defiance became impossible to ignore. Public disagreement. Private warnings. Strategic disobedience. The tension finally reached a level where authority could no longer coexist. And then, silence. A decision was made in Washington that would shock the world. The uncrowned emperor of post-war Japan was about to be removed from command. The message arrived like a sudden execution of authority, clean, irreversible, final. No dramatic build-up. No negotiation left. Just the cold reality of command. General Douglas MacArthur was relieved of his duties. The man who had once overseen the transformation of an entire nation was now being told his role in history had ended. For Japan, the shock was quieter, but deeper. Because MacArthur's departure didn't feel like the end of occupation, it felt like the end of an era where one figure had stood above everything, silently shaping the country's rebirth from behind the curtain of power. Inside Japan, the system he built remained. The constitution still stood. The military restrictions remained. The political framework continued to guide a nation now moving toward economic recovery and global reintegration. Even Emperor Hirohito remained in his symbolic role, no longer divine, but still central to Japan's identity in a changed world. And yet, something undeniable lingered in the structure of modern Japan. The reforms, the institutions, the political boundaries all carried the imprint of a single period when one American general held extraordinary influence over the fate of an entire country. MacArthur would return home to the United States, a controversial figure. To some, he was a visionary who prevented chaos and rebuilt a nation from ruin. To others, he was a man who held too much power for too long in a country that was not his own. But history rarely remembers men in simple terms. It remembers moments. And in the ruins of post-war Japan, there was a moment when an empire fell silent, and an uncrowned emperor walked through its ashes not to conquer it, but to rebuild it in his own image. A general who ruled without a crown, and left behind a nation forever changed.